Chapter 11, Cardiovascular System. So the cardiovascular system will cover the structure of the heart, their functions, the conduction system of the heart, and the flow of blood through the heart. So the cardiovascular system basically refers to the heart and everything associated with the heart. And the circulatory system, on the other hand, includes the blood vessels and the lymphatics and the heart. So basically everything that's involved in circulation of blood through the body. So the heart is basically a very important organ, and it is independent of the brain. So it's capable of beating on its own because it has its own conduction system. And this allows the heart to continuously pump oxygen-rich blood to the cells. The cells take up the oxygen, generate energy, and on the way back, blood carries back deoxygenated blood, which is really CO2-rich blood. Along with the gases, it carries waste products and hormones from one part of the body to the other. So the heart is located in the thoracic cavity, and it's located medially between the lungs, meaning in between two lungs. And the space in between two lungs over here is called the mediastinum. So this is the posterior view, this is the spine, and right over here is the sternum, or the chest bone right over here. Now, within the mediastinum, the heart is further separated from other mediastinal structures by a membrane known as the pericardium right over here. And it contains the pericardial sac, which has serous fluids that prevent the heart from friction from other structures. Now, right over here under the heart, you see the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. So really, the heart begins right at the second rib. So this is important when people perform surgeries, because right over here is where the heart is located approximately. Now, the dorsal surface of the heart lies near the vertebrae, and the anterior surface sits near the sternum. And the heart has vessels, blood vessels that carry blood to the heart and away from the heart, that we call as veins and arteries. We'll look at those blood vessels in a lot more detail in just a minute. Now, the heart has a base which is located at the third costal cartilage. So right over here, the top of the heart is called the base, and the bottom pointy end of the heart is called the apex. So this is unusual because apex means the tip, and usually when you think of the apex, you think of the top. But in case of the heart, this pointy end of the heart is called the apex of the heart. Yeah. So this picture shows a closer view of the heart in the mediastinum. Now the heart is about the size of the fist, and in between, if we're on the heart, which is on the base of the heart, you see the great veins, that is the vena cava, and the aorta that are connected. So this over here is a superior vena cava that drains the blood from the upper extremities to be brought to the heart, and the inferior vena cava that you don't see over here drains the lower extremities and carries deoxygenated blood to the heart. Now, in general, in anatomy, if you see a red blood vessel, it contains oxygenated blood, and if you see a blue vessel, it contains deoxygenated blood. So if you see that the heart, now when you're looking at the heart, this side is the left and this side is the right, because this is the anterior view. So when you look at the X-ray pictures of the lung, you might see a little indentation on the left lung. So this indentation on the left lung is actually called the cardiac notch, and this is the slight deviation of the apex into the left side of the lungs, because it grows, or it sits towards the left lung and leaves a little indentation that we call the cardiac notch. So one thing we didn't talk about when we're looking at the location of the heart is about CPR. So this point over here, this pointy end, is called the xiphoid process. The CPR, or cardiopulmonary resuscitation, is performed 2 fingers above the xiphoid process. Now, when this process is performed by untrained individuals, it can result in broken ribs, and sometimes the damage is so severe that it can drive this pointy end of the xiphoid process into the liver, which can prove fatal to the patient. So this picture over here shows the layers of the heart, and the membrane that surrounds the heart is called the pericardial cavity. So right over here, it's a fluid-filled structure, and the parietal pericardium is the layer between this fibrous pericardium and in between the visceral pericardium. So the visceral pericardium, in a sense, is both the inner layer of the pericardium. Now the pericardium consists of the fibrous layer, the parietal layer, the fluid-filled sac known as pericardial cavity, and the visceral layer. Now, the visceral pericardium, like I said, is both the inner layer of the pericardium and the outermost layer of the heart. Now, this pericardial cavity is continuous with the outer layer of the heart, which we call the parietal layer of the pericardium. Now, the epicardium is a part of the visceral layer of the heart, and the epicardium consists of mesothelium, which is just a layer of simple squamous epithelium which constantly secretes the serous fluid that you find in the pericardial cavity. So the simple squamous epithelial tissue is also surrounded by areolar tissue. Now, myocardium is basically the cardiac muscle tissue, and the cardiac muscle tissue is made up of cardiac muscles and some connective tissue. And the innermost layer of the heart itself is called the endocardium. Now, the endocardium is made up of areolar connective tissue and the endothelium, which is the innermost layer of the cells. So, the pericardial cavity helps in preventing friction of the heart as it beats. So it prevents the heart from rubbing against other surrounding structures in the mediastinum. Now, if excess of fluid builds up in the pericardial space, it can lead to a condition that you call cardiac tamponade or pericardial tamponade. So it can have several reasons. It can either be due to damage of the pericardial cavity, or it can be due to some infection, or a myocardial rupture, which is rupture of the myocardium, cancer, so many different reasons. Now, the excess fluid can be removed, but it can also lead to further damage in the cardiovascular system. As fluid builds up in the pericardial cavity, it can lead to lesser and lesser blood ejected from the heart. So the heart becomes less and less efficient with excessive fluid in the cavity. Now, if this is untreated, it can lead to death. So the heart has 4 chambers. So it's basically a pump with 4 chambers, and the atrium serves as the receiving chambers, and the ventricle serves as the pumping chambers or the discharging chambers. Since the atrium receive chambers are the receiving chambers, the blood enters here under very low pressure, which helps in filling the ventricles. Ventricles are positioned under the atrium. Now the ventricles are basically the pumping chamber, so they are thicker walled than the atria, and during contraction of the heart, blood is pushed into either the systemic circulation circuit, which is to the body systems, through the major veins to the major veins and arteries of the body, and the other type of circulation is pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary circulation involves pumping blood to the lungs, and in the lungs, gas is exchanged. So the deoxygenated blood drops off carbon dioxide in the lungs and carries back oxygen back to the heart. So the ventricles are involved in pulmonary or systemic circulations because these are the ones that are connected to the blood vessels directly that are involved in the pulmonary and systemic circuits. So this picture over here, you see the right atrium, the left atrium, the left ventricle, and the right ventricle. So the heart has 4 chambers. So this is located inside the pericardium. So the surface features of the heart include a prominent structure we call the auricles. So these are the ear-like structures, which mean, well, they call the auricle because they resemble the shape of the external human ear. And when you look at the anatomy of the heart, the location of the auricles can tell you whether you're looking at, along with the pulmonary trunk and aorta, can tell you they're looking at the anterior or posterior view. Okay, if you're looking at the anterior view of the heart, you can locate the right auricle, and right over here is the left auricle. Under the right auricle, you have the right atrium, and under the left auricle, you have the left atrium. Now, there are also some fat-filled grooves in the heart, which you call sulcus. Okay, the sulcus it contain a lot of blood vessels. So the coronary sulcus is located between the atrium and the ventricles, and so you have the anterior interventricular sulcus and the posterior interventricular sulcus. So you have the anterior interventricular sulcus in the front. So this is the anterior interventricular sulcus. And then the posterior interventricular sulcus will be present in between the ventricles on the back. So right over here, you see the coronary sulcus, which is present on the right side of the heart. So if you look at the layers of the heart, you can see the cross section over here. The cross section shows you the inside of the heart. So right over here, we are looking at the ventricles. And the ventricles are the bottom chambers which are involved in discharging blood. So you can see the right ventricle. So this is the anterior view of the heart. The right ventricle has thinner myocardial tissue or the walls, but the left ventricle has really thick walls. Why? Because the left ventricle pumps blood to all the different organ systems and cells and tissues of the body. So the left ventricle is involved in systemic circulation, and the right ventricle does not have thick walls because it pumps blood only to the lungs for exchange of gases and nutrients. So the left ventricle pumps blood under a lot of pressure compared to the right ventricle. For this reason, the left ventricle needs to have really thick walls to withstand the pressure. Now, right above the ventricles, you have the right atrium over here and the left atrium over here. And the wall in between the ventricles is called the interventricular septum. So when you actually dissect a heart in the lab, you'll see that the really thick portion is the really muscular interventricular septum of the heart. So remember, heart is a pump, and the chambers that pump are called the ventricles. So right over here, you see the right ventricle and left ventricle. Now, the heart follows a pattern of circulations because the right ventricle is involved in pumping blood to the lungs. So we call it a pulmonary circulation. Now, the left ventricle is involved in pumping blood to the different body systems. So we call it a systemic circulation. So this aorta over here carries blood, oxygenated blood, to different parts of the body. So we call it a systemic circuit. Now, if you remember, we talked about red blood vessels and blue blood vessels. Now these, let's give them a name. So the red blood vessels will be called arteries. Now these are red because they contain, for the most part, oxygenated blood. Now a more accurate definition of the arteries is that arteries always carry blood away from the heart. And the blue blood vessels usually carry deoxygenated, usually are called veins, and they carry blood towards the heart. Now there are exceptions like this structure over here. You call it the pulmonary trunk. Now the pulmonary trunk is involved in carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs. So this blood vessel is called a pulmonary artery, and it is involved in the pulmonary circuit. And right over here, you see the pulmonary veins. Now the left and right pulmonary veins carry oxygenated blood from the lungs back into the heart. So you don't see it right in this picture, but this right pulmonary vein actually go around the back, and they bring oxygenated blood from the right lungs to the left atrium, and the left pulmonary veins bring in oxygenated blood from the left lungs into the left atrium. Okay. So if you look at the internal structure of the heart, okay. So if you look at the internal structure of the heart, you see the septa. Septa basically means the wall or something that divides something, a structure. So a septa is basically a physical extension of the myocardium, and normally in an adult heart, the interventricular, an adult heart, the interventricular septum is really thick, and the interventricular septum, the name suggests, in between the ventricles. The interventricular septum divides the left ventricle from the right ventricle. Okay, so If you remember that the right ventricle had really thin walls and the left ventricle had really thick walls, because the left ventricle is involved in systemic circulation of the blood, whereas the right ventricle is involved in pulmonary circulation of the blood. So it only pumps blood to the lungs. Okay. The walls in between the atrium and the ventricle is known as the atrioventricular septum, and the valves in between the two is known as the atrioventricular valve.